On October 29, 1969, a UCLA student named Charlie Klein attempted to transmit the word login to a computer at Stanford Research Institute. The system crashed after the second character, the first message ever sent on ARPANET, the network that would become the Internet, was low. History records this as the birth of the Internet. What history does not usually record is that 7 years earlier, in 1962, a Soviet mathematician named Viktor Glushkov had submitted to the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union a proposal for a nationwide real-time computer network, connecting every industrial enterprise, every planning bureau, and every research institution in the USSR that was technically more sophisticated than ARPANET in several respects. The proposal was called OGAS, and it was killed, not for technical reasons, but for political ones, by the very government that had commissioned it. This is the Soviet Internet history, OGAS. It is a story about a technology that could have changed the Cold War's technological balance, and about how the institution most threatened by that technology, not a foreign adversary, but the Soviet government itself, successfully prevented it from existing. To understand what OGAS was and why it mattered, you need to understand the Soviet economic problem of the early 1960s. The USSR had achieved extraordinary technological feats. Sputnik in 1957, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, nuclear parity with the United States. Soviet science was genuinely competitive with the West at the highest levels. The Soviet economy, however, was confronting a problem that had been growing since the 1930s. The Central Planning System, Gosplan, was responsible for coordinating the production and distribution of millions of goods across 11 time zones, and was doing so primarily with paper, pencil, and human calculation. By the early 1960s, Gosplan employed approximately 1 million people. Even so, the computation required to optimize the production and logistics of the Soviet economy was, by contemporary estimates, orders of magnitude beyond what human bureaucracies could achieve. The result was endemic inefficiency, factories producing goods that were not needed, shortages of goods that were needed, production targets that bore little relationship to actual demand. Viktor Mikhailovich Glushkov understood this problem better than almost anyone in the Soviet Union. Born in 1923 in Rostov-on-Don, Glushkov had trained as a mathematician, and by 1960 was director of the Institute of Cybernetics in Kyiv. He was one of the Soviet Union's foremost experts in computing and mathematical economics, and he had spent the late 1950s developing a theory of how computer networks could transform economic management. Glushkov's intellectual framework was influenced by Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, the science of communication and control in systems, and by the operational research methods being developed simultaneously in the West for military logistics. He understood that the Soviet economy's planning problem was fundamentally an information problem, and he believed he had a solution. Glushkov's proposal, submitted to the Soviet leadership in 1962 under the formal name Obshtegosudarstvenaya Automatizirovanaya Sistema, or OGAS, was remarkable for its ambition and its technical specificity. OGAS proposed a three-tier network connecting approximately 20,000 nodes, major industrial enterprises, regional planning centers, and the central Gosplan complex in Moscow. At the lowest tier, factories and enterprises would have local computing stations monitoring production in real time. These would connect to approximately 200 regional processing centers. The regional centers would connect to a national center in Moscow. The entire system would enable real-time monitoring of production, automatic adjustment of resource allocation, and coordination of the supply chain without the delays inherent in paper-based planning. In technical terms, what Glushkov was proposing in 1962 bore significant resemblance to what ARPANET achieved in 1969, a distributed network of computing nodes capable of exchanging data across geographic distances. In some respects, particularly its real-time economic management functions, OGAS was more ambitious than ARPANET, which was initially conceived primarily as a research communication tool rather than an economic management system. Glushkov estimated the cost of building OGAS at approximately 20 billion rubles over 15 to 20 years. This was a substantial sum, roughly equivalent to the Soviet space program budget. But Glushkov argued that the economic efficiency gains would recover the investment within 5 years. The proposal received serious attention at the highest levels of the Soviet government. Glushkov presented it to the Council of Ministers and to Nikita Khrushchev. There was genuine interest. The Soviet leadership understood that the planning problem was real and growing, and that computing offered a potential solution. For approximately 8 years, from 1962 to 1970, OGAS moved through Soviet bureaucratic approval processes, never quite reaching the formal authorization that would have funded its construction. The opposition to OGAS did not come from technical skepticism. It came from institutions that understood exactly what OGAS would do and feared it. Benjamin Peters' research, based on Soviet archives opened after 1991, identifies 3 categories of institutional opposition. The first was the Ministry of Finance, which controlled the information about enterprise costs and profits that OGAS would have made transparent to the planning system. Under the existing system, ministries had significant discretion over financial reporting. OGAS would have replaced ministerial discretion with automated real-time data. The Finance Ministry's objections were framed as technical concerns about data accuracy, but their substantive effect would have been to preserve the ministry's information advantage. The second source of opposition was the KGB. The security services were deeply uncomfortable with the concept of a nationwide information network. In the Soviet political system, information was power, specifically the power to surveil, to control, and to conceal. A network that allowed real-time monitoring of economic activity across the entire country was also a network that could, in principle, monitor the economic activity of party officials and ministry employees. The KGB's preference was for information systems that concentrated data in accessible locations, not distributed systems where data might move unpredictably. The third and most powerful source of opposition was what Peters calls the local bureaucratic economy, the system of informal exchanges, favors, and information asymmetries that allowed Soviet enterprise managers and ministry officials to navigate the planning system and extract personal benefit from it. Under formal Soviet economics, enterprise managers were supposed to meet centrally planned targets. In practice, they operated in a gray economy of reciprocal favors, informal resource exchanges, and strategically reported figures. OGAS threatened this informal economy directly. Real-time, automated production monitoring would have made it significantly harder to conceal production capacity, to underreport output for later sale on the informal market, or to falsify fulfillment of planning targets. For a substantial portion of the Soviet management class, people with significant informal economic interests in the existing opacity, OGAS was not a planning tool. It was a surveillance system. None of these objections were articulated as political resistance. They were articulated as technical concerns, data accuracy problems, infrastructure costs, implementation complexity. But Peters' archival research identifies the pattern clearly. The institutions most economically threatened by OGAS's transparency were the same institutions most actively raising technical objections. The decisive moment for OGAS arrived in 1970, at a meeting of the Council of Ministers convened to consider Glushkov's revised proposal. By this point, Glushkov had spent 8 years navigating Soviet bureaucratic approval processes, modifying the OGAS concept in response to objections, and building political support among the scientific community. At the 1970 meeting, the Council of Ministers approved a resolution, not to build OGAS, but to create a series of smaller, ministry-specific, automated systems of management, individual computing systems within each ministry, controlled by that ministry, not connected to each other. The resolution gave each ministry the ability to automate its own operations independently, without the network layer that would have made information visible across institutional boundaries. This decision had the appearance of progress. The Soviet government was investing in computing for economic management, while eliminating the feature that would have made OGAS politically dangerous. A network of isolated ministry computing systems preserved exactly the information silos that had made the informal bureaucratic economy possible. Glushkov continued to advocate for networked economic computing through the 1970s, publishing theoretical work on OGAS and maintaining the proposal in revised forms. He died in 1982. The OGAS network was never built. What was built, the fragmented ministry-level computing systems, generated significant costs and modest efficiency improvements. Without network integration, the planning problem that Glushkov had identified persisted through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Economists studying the late Soviet period have noted that the information problem in central planning, the inability to aggregate and process the data needed for effective economic coordination, worsened rather than improved in the decade after OGAS was effectively shelved. While OGAS was navigating Soviet bureaucratic resistance, ARPANET was growing. TCP/IP was developed in 1974. The Ethernet standard was published in 1976. The Internet, as a technology, evolved rapidly in the West through precisely the period when OGAS was being shelved. The Soviet Union did eventually connect to the Internet, partially through academic networks in the 1980s, and more broadly after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. By that point, the architecture of the global Internet had been established without Soviet participation. The network that Glushkov had proposed, which might have given the Soviet economy an information processing capability comparable to what the Internet gave Western economies, did not exist. Whether OGAS would have significantly changed the Soviet Union's economic trajectory is genuinely contested among historians. The information problem Glushkov identified was real. Whether a networked planning system could have resolved it, or whether the Soviet economy's fundamental problems were structural in ways that no information technology could address, remains a question that economic historians have not converged on. The standard version of the OGAS story is a Cold War story, the Soviet Union failing to match Western technological innovation. That version is incomplete. OGAS failed not because Soviet engineers lacked the capability to build it. Glushkov's team had the technical knowledge. It failed because the technology was correctly understood by the institutions most threatened by it as a redistribution of information power. A real-time economic network would have made economic data visible across institutional boundaries, and the institutions that benefited from information opacity defeated it through bureaucratic obstruction, dressed as technical skepticism. This is not a uniquely Soviet pathology. Peters makes this observation explicitly in his conclusion. The story of OGAS is not primarily about the deficiencies of socialist planning. It is about how institutions that benefit from opacity resist technologies that create transparency, regardless of the political system in which those institutions operate. The incumbents of the information economy, wherever they sit, have a structural interest in preventing the redistribution of information that would undermine their position. The question OGAS leaves open is whether we have resolved this dynamic in the information age or simply relocated it. The Internet made a great deal of information more accessible than it was in 1962. It also created new concentrated nodes of information control: the platforms, the cloud providers, the data brokers, the surveillance systems. The specific topology of information power has changed. Whether the underlying dynamic, institutions with information advantages resisting redistribution, has changed is a harder question. Glushkov died in 1982, 2 years before the personal computer reached mass adoption. His proposal had spent 20 years in Soviet bureaucratic limbo. He never saw the Internet. He had already described most of it. The comments are open. Benjamin Peters' How Not to Network a Nation is available through MIT Press. The Garovich Internet paper is available open access through Taylor and Francis. Both are in the description.